This is a compelling story. In spite of its purposeful lack of whimsy and wonder, it is a compelling story, and in several important ways. And I have several reasons for believing this. It's the story of a loyal soldier of an empire whose very structures and presumptions of power and society are fundamentally acting against her. It's the journey of a heroine who, despite harboring bitter memories of her home and no particular fondness for her nation, flies and fights hard for the victories and survival of her crew and airship, and even for her fellow soldiers in battle. And it's an inspiration that, despite the short sighted incompetence and selfish cruelty of imperial power, Josette and her crew find empowerment and self validation through flying and fighting their airship. It's a story also driven by a character's arc in Burnat's journey from a privileged and unproductive member of the ruling class to a trusted and reliable member of Josette's crew, sharing in their struggles and acting on his own to protect them from selfish deceit. In addition, the story's world, both socio-political and economic, and technological, are intriguing in how incongruous they are, both in comparison to real life and how they fit together in the same world. In story, Garnia and Vinzalia are ruled by aristocracy. Economies are nearly feudal in nature. Warfare is Napoleonic, and technology is advancing in ways unexpected of the real-life historical equivalent. From my perspective, the world is somewhat undefined, and that's actually acceptable, because the point of the story is not the geography or political boundaries of the world. It is that the characters fight together to survive a world that's inflicted a classically brutal and morally irrelevant war upon them. Josette is one of the two point-of-view characters we follow throughout the story, and the one we may more easily invest our sympathy in from the start. Based on the omniscient third-person perspective, we learn that Josette started her life in Durham, and took to some childish mischief and found wonder in trying to discover the artifacts of the town's history. There's a gap in our knowledge as to what led Josette to next enroll in Garnia's military education system, to become an airman while disguised as a boy. We find reference to her father dying of syphilis while serving in the army, and can infer that she and her mother Elise became estranged. When the ruling monarch of Garnia pushed for the acceptance of women into Garnia's military, Josette was one of the first accepted as an officer, and spent 10 years serving as an auxiliary officer in the Aerial Signal Corps. During that time, where men reasonably expected to be promoted to greater positions of power and responsibility, Josette had to contend with similar levels of responsibility and far less of the trust and prestige afforded her male counterparts. We actually start seeing Josette's story in the aftermath of a battle in which she was instrumental in winning. Through dialogue, Josette pieces together what happened before she took a blow to the head. Her captain was killed in combat. She took command of the airship, landed it on top of an enemy position, and the actions of herself, the crew, and the airship, purposefully brought down upon them, made achieving victory for their army in the field possible, where the ranking general's plan did not and presumably could not do so. When her exemplary actions earn her fame among the troops, and the favorable attention of Garnian printed media, the army's ranking general summons her for a promotion and a new command, making her the first woman captain to command her own airship, and it is expressly set up as an appeasement to the monarchy. With the introduction of Burnat and his scheme to discredit Josette on behalf of the general, it then becomes a setup to ensure that no matter what service Josette renders on behalf of Garnia, she will be doomed to an ignoble future. But at least for a time, Josette can gather her crew, command her airship, and tests its capabilities, finally using her knowledge and experience to push beyond what she was allowed to do so before. Josette takes her airship Mistral and her crew to their limits, survive mishaps, and in time achieve a military victory. Her airships and crew's first combat encounter is a fateful one. Over her hometown of Durham, long neglected in her attention and affection, she fights a Venzalian airship, earning herself a bittersweet victory, and suffering some casualties and damage from the battle. Over the course of her short stay in Durham, she uncovers evidence of an enemy military operation to invade Garnia through Durham and threaten the heart of the Empire. With desperate haste, she takes her crew and airship back up to find the Vin invasion force, survive enemy airships, and aid in the defense of Durham. When the battle for Durham is lost, Josette turns back to race ahead of the invasion, waging a one-woman fighting retreat to give the Garnian military time to organize and stop the Vin invasion. When she returns to her military command and reports back to the ranking general, she is assured that she will be stripped of her command despite her service to her nation, and sent to a posting ensuring she is imperiled and forgotten for daring to outshine her quote-unquote superiors. It is with the intervention of a changed Burnett that saves Josette from this end, and allows her to take her airship and crew into the battle to defend against the Vin invasion. Come battle's end, and the salvation of Garnia, or at least its prestige, Josette, Burnett, and crew take Mistral to the air once again for the next adventure. What's interesting about Josette and her adventure is that we don't get any explicit mention of why she does what she does. Towards the end of the book, she says that someone has to do what she does, and if she doesn't do it, someone else may fail. But why this leaves her motivation vague is that we don't get a sense of what values drive her to captain an airship in Garnia's military, and quite skillfully so. Mostly we have to read between the lines. One way we can infer her values is how she treats the other characters she interacts with. With her Sergeant Jutes, before she commands Mistral, she is concerned for and receptive to his physical condition, especially after bloody battle. When in command, she trusts him to serve her without any sign of insecurity or reproach. With her executive officer Nicholas Martel, not only is she on familiar terms with him, presumably from past service together, but even under her command, she doesn't demand deference for any sake of propriety. To the senior crewmen, mechanic Gears and carpenter Chips, she literally commands them without hesitation, nor indulges indecisive pause, even when her commands are unexpected. For her Ensign Kember and junior mechanic Gray, she is firm in her command, but also gives guidance to improve their performance, and cares for their well-being when in mortal peril. Even without explicit interaction, we get a sense from her internal monologue that she feels the need to validate the crew one way or another. When the opportunity to fight an enemy Venzalian airship presents itself, Josette considers whether to validate the part of the crew seeking combat, or to serve the needs of the other crew, getting to grips with their revolutionary new airship. As for other people not in her crew, Josette treats her mother Elise with bitterness, the quartermaster with exasperation, the military and government officials with a strict feigned deference, fellow officers like Gaston Katsura with sarcasm, or a familiar acquaintance like Captain Emery, and antagonized civilians with a harsh resolve. Taken all together, I can make a personal best guess as to what Josette values and what drives her to act the ways she does. Where her superiors are concerned, she is outwardly strictly respectful, while concealing a contempt that's justified, at least in her mind. With her peers, whether or not she respects them personally, she is more casual and perhaps may care for their approval, depending on what respect she holds for them. When Emery was loyal to her and her former secret as a woman in the military academy, she continued to trust in his sense of honor and duty. She also holds respect for her late former captain Tobel, who earned the loyalty of herself and the rest of the Osprey's crew long before he died in battle. With her subordinates like Martel, Kember, Gray, and Jutes, she cares to put them at ease and offer the more junior crew her knowledge and encouragement. So perhaps what Josette values is one's receptiveness to learning, greatly dislikes arrogance or other unearned confidence, and values reciprocating the kindness of others. It appears she also empathizes with people wanting to fly as well. When she goes to the quartermaster's warehouse and finds Private Corn left to guard the stores, she readily accepts adding him to her crew, even if only to gain timely access to the warehouse. But if that was all she cared about, she could have easily had Jutes reject his admission when the time for boarding came. Learning that Corn always wanted to fly, and letting that assistant of a quartermaster on as an equal member of her crew shows how Josette is readily inclined to uplift others she finds not unlike herself. I can imagine that she recognized in Corn the want to literally rise above earthly troubles, like she might have. As for how she views civilians, it may be that she has little patience for them in general, perhaps given an upbringing that was more antagonistic for her. It would make sense then that she would be repulsed by the norms of provincial life and be drawn to the camaraderie of military service. Like she said, she tried not antagonizing people before, and it didn't work, so she doesn't bother with anything less than overwhelming and audacious force to compel civilians to get out of her way. It's plain to see that she holds contempt for the ignorance and petty pride of civilians in general. Even in combat and warfare in general, we get insight into more of Josette's character. Whether she chooses to seek or avoid combat with the enemy, not only does she have compassion for her crew, her compassion even extends somewhat to fellow aircrew of other airships, even her sworn enemies. Their first combat in Mistral takes them head-to-head against a Vin scout ship, which is handily defeated by Mistral's superior firepower and gunnery. But when the enemy's surrender comes too late to avoid the death blow, Josette is very much concerned that the enemy crew survive. Despite trying to give them a message as to how to save themselves, the scout is destroyed completely with no survivors. We could interpret her reaction as disappointment in not gaining intelligence from captured enemies, or dejection that fellow aircrew died a violent death that might have been avoided. It could be simple empathy that, as fellow flyers, they face similar dangers and mortal peril, and would not wish such useless violence and calamity to cause more carnage than can or should be called for. In my view, it's similar to how warships that sink their enemies, their crews may be inclined to stop and pick up survivors out of the water, notwithstanding the practicality of such an action, depending on the war in question. It appears that despite the notion of aircrew being hungry for glory and combat, or at least Josette's view of her crew as such, she herself doesn't relish combat and war, no matter how good she is at it. The one time we see Josette in mortal combat with Vin cavalry scouts, she's more concerned with forcing their surrender than outright killing them, notwithstanding the utility of interrogating prisoners. Even despite how personally she was offended by the Vin invasion, first of Durham, then their assault on Arles, and Garnia in general, in the end she rejects holding on to her enmity for the Vins. Perhaps as long as she has her airship and crew intact, this is what matters most to Josette. We can see Josette is perhaps happiest or closest to it when she's commanding and flying her airship, finding ways to get the most performance out of the vessel and crew, and is most comfortable in that sacred spot on the hurricane deck, around which the entire airship operates. Away from the folly of scheming generals, simpleton officials, and dense yokels, What Josette may value most is the empowerment provided by flying an airship with a loyal, competent crew. What Josette struggles with most is her perception of her crew's perception and confidence in her as a captain. And through fitting her airship, forming her crew, drilling them through flight trials, surviving a near disaster, facing first combat, and racing against an enemy invasion to save Garnia, Josette eventually comes into her own, perhaps equal to the towering figure, that goddess of war, that her crew and the army first saw her as. Burnett forms the other half of the story's point of view, and thanks to the omniscient third-person viewpoint, is more transparent in his motivations and his changes throughout his voyage with Josette on Mistral. We first see Burnett as a privileged, unproductive member of Garnia's aristocracy, spending his time between his indulgences, gambling and bedding mature women. It is when he goes seeking more money from his family that his family, like his uncle the General Fearon, decides to make him useful, or at least outside their attention, by enrolling Burnett into the army. It is then with the arrival of Josette and General Fearon's begrudging assignment of her command that Burnett saves himself from a Fusilier's death by offering to be his spy on her ship, such that he may write a narrative fit to destroy her reputation with the army, the printed media, and the monarchy, and thus leave Fearon clear to assign her to a backwater oblivion. Under the cover of Observer for Airship Operations, Burnett is indulged with explanations as to how the airship functions and is operated and maintained, and by extension so too are we, the audience. Despite Burnett's presumption of Josette as a poor captain and flyer, the fact that she continues with her duties to utmost proficiency and heedless of his judgment is not lost on him. His eyes, trained to see the bluffs at the gambling table, see the unrelenting and sincere emotions and dispositions of Josette and her crew as they come to grips with their new airship and the war at large. In time, Burnett almost literally forgets his mission to defame Josette to save his own life from military service and get a payday out of it. When the airship Mistral lands at Durham to refurbish supplies, repair damage, and offload casualties, Burnett at once sends his slanderous notes back to his general uncle, but also meets Josette's mother, Elise, and is quite smitten with her, despite his likely original intent to harass and put off balance Josette herself. This, combined with the existential Vin threat discovered by Josette and Mistral, and the loss of Durham to Vin invasion, Burnett is changed, and doesn't bother continuing his original mission. We also learn that after Josette very literally spells out the Vin threat to him, unbeknownst to her, he sends a warning message with a hefty monetary incentive back to his general uncle to get the military mobilized against the threat, while Josette concerned herself with denying food and water to the invaders. Without any explicit dialogue, it's clear from this point that Burnett goes to Josette's side. After having seen her composure and proficiency in airship combat, her care for her airship and crew, her distressed home life, and her personal offense at losing her home to Vin invasion, Burnett chooses to continue sharing in Josette's and her crew's perilous duty, even when given the chance to escape to the safety of his old life. Using his sense of perception and savviness for narrative that would have doomed Josette, he instead blackmails his truly incompetent general of an uncle into letting Josette keep her command for the upcoming battle. Even if he never explicitly describes his reasons for his change of heart, especially if he himself doesn't know the reasons, it's clear that flying with Josette and Mistral has awoken a sense of camaraderie with the aircrew that he values far more than his old safe life of gambling and womanizing. In addition to Josette and Burnett, the Mistral crew themselves have their own character, speaking to our leads variously through Jutes, Martel, Kember, and Gray. Indeed, Josette wrestles with her own perception of the crew, and throughout the story there is a struggle for at least these two characters, Captain Josette Dupre and Mistral's crew, to see eye to eye. Rather than being an ensemble cast of characters, the crew is an aggregate of attitudes and dispositions that Josette and Burnett interact with throughout the story. We see from Burnett's newcomer point of view what dispositions the crew has even before they're assembled to launch the airship. Seeing the crew facing down the harsh evaluation from the Sergeant Jutes and the rigors of aerial gunnery practice, Burnett witnesses how eager the crew is to fly and fight the airship. Given his closer interactions with Ensign Kember and Private Gray, he is stunned at how easily the women approach the danger of using weaponry and facing combat, not to mention how easily they reciprocate his familiarity. When Mistral is in danger of falling by a broken tail, and only the combined effort of Josette and Burnett buys time to save them, the crew easily congratulates Burnett for his part of the effort, much to Josette's annoyance. But the reason for the discrepancy can be explained. The crew look upon Josette far differently than Burnett, and largely due to a sense of propriety. As Josette starts out her command and is confronted with the unexpected performance of Mistral, her initiative to improve the airship's performance is seemingly met with the crew's incredulity. When a lull in the flight for the in-flight modifications gives an opening for a shooting competition, the crew is at first jubilant to see their captain demonstrate her superior shooting, only to become dejected when Burnett bests her by a hair over greater and greater ranges. And when news comes that an enemy scout is sighted over Durham and ripe for the kill, it is Jutes that finally speaks to the crew's disposition. Where Josette figured the crew was only begrudgingly indulging her to go through their paces, Jutes reveals how the crew is in awe of her, given her past performance on the battlefield preceding the story, and were hoping for a chance to find a glorious victory in battle worthy of her nascent legend. Even going against her own view of her orders to simply put Mistral through its trials, and her own good sense not to senselessly endanger the untested ship and crew, Josette chooses to validate the crew and put them on course to draw first blood, and kick off the rest of the adventure. Where the crew feels comfortable openly congratulating Burnett for his effort to save the airship, following Josette's example, the crew has such respect for Josette and her legend that they dare not risk impropriety by acting less than worthy of her command. In a way, Josette is a victim of her own success. We can tell from her point of view that she'd rather be more familiar and trusted by her crew rather than scaring them, as it were. It's just that her achievement in battle is so momentous that the crew have to get over their awe of her before they can feel at ease under her command. From that point on, Josette and crew face the enemy invasion, from scout and chasseur airships to columns of musketmen and cannons, and learn to implicitly trust each other to face the dangers and keep themselves alive as well as fight. There is little concern from that point on that the crew ever doubts the validity or sense of Josette's command. Even the Mistral airship herself is, in a sense, a character, at least from Josette's perspective. Given that she's a revolutionary new design, Josette and crew are initially wary of her integrity and fickleness. The very first flight proves Mistral has much to offer and much more to give. Such is Mistral's potential that Josette doesn't hesitate to seek ways of coaxing out the best possible performance from the airship. The first hurdle in the story of Josette's command is the seeming miserliness that Mistral apparently has in demonstrating her power and speed. It is with great joy, then, when Josette finally modifies Mistral's powertrain such that she finally gains the speed that was promised, and the airship is now truly Josette's to fly. When Mistral nearly fell back to Earth from a turn taken too fast and hard, and the tail nearly pulling itself apart, after saving the ship and reinforcing the tail, Mistral never again falters in its flying and fighting. Facing combat against determined enemies, Mistral in turn proves just as tough as her captain and crew, as she carries them from battle after battle. By the end, Mistral has survived an in-flight refit, a nearly destroyed tail, enemy airship attack, gunfire from the ground, and massive onboard fires. Just like her illustrious captain, Mistral just won't die. Truly a fitting command for Josette herself.